With this kit being a curbside, there's not a whole lot to the engine or the chassis, so I just lumped it all together in one video. With that being said, can we make it any better? I think we can. Let's find out. We gotta take a minute to talk about Fujimi's quality. Yeah, I know it's hidden and never gonna be seen, but the finish on some of these parts is atrocious. And I am being extremely generous when I use the word finish on some of these parts. For example, while I was cleaning up the parts, I found that more than 2 of them, but less than 5, had some casting defects. Now this one's really no big deal. I just drill a hole as close to center as I can, then I was going to use my hobby knife to go in there and kind of waller it out. Problem with that is that the blade is too wide to get down into there, so I end up resorting to my old school method of using my little micro drill as a coping saw. My next complaint is the way that they had molded in the standoffs for the sprues on these fender wells. That whole area of the chassis where they mount is completely flat. So if you don't cut these off perfectly and sand them down extra smooth, these are not going to fit right. I don't want to scare you because it's actually pretty easy. Just snip them off and sand them down. My area of worry though was oversanding them so that it would create a gap and we would see daylight through there. Now if you pay attention later, you'll notice that when I go to install these, I use a whole lot of super glue. In my case, the chassis was warped just ever so slightly, and these acted as a means of holding everything in alignment. Now speaking of the chassis, since everything is hidden and I don't display my models upside down, I'm just going to paint everything with some hardware store flat black. Now this stuff is extremely hot chemically, and it likes to burn and craze plastic. So I went over the bottom of the chassis with a few coats of primer just to seal it in and protect it, then went over it with some very light coats. Now the good thing about flat paints is that they dry rather quickly. This is already dry. It's ready for the second coat. Now the key to this is waiting until it's dry and keeping the coats light. Because if you lay it on, it's going to take longer to dry and it's going to be exposed to the plastic longer and it's going to have more time to etch into it. Now, despite me doing all my prep work and knowing what to do and how to avoid it, I still had just a little bit of crazing. Moving on though, the calipers on these things are in 2 pieces, and it's a very tiny, fiddly little piece. So a pro tip would be to leave a little bit of sprue on it so you have something to hold on to while you're lining everything up. Now once all the adhesive is dry and everything is locked in place, just go back and clip off that little piece of sprue. Now these are in 2 pieces because the rotor spins within the caliper. And as far as the instructions goes, they want you to put the rotor in place, then that fiddly little piece of caliper over it to essentially lock it in. As you can see, it's just as easy to get the rotor in there if you build up the calipers beforehand. Now, since this car came out way back in the day, steel and cast iron was the material of choice for brakes. This is well before carbon ceramic was even an idea. They were, however, still ahead of their time because they were a two-piece rotor. So I'm going to paint everything black, and then I'm going to mask off the rotor hat and paint the rotor meat. I don't know what you call that part. The actual rotor in a TS17 gloss aluminium. It makes a very convincing steel, believe it or not. And now off camera, I just kind of misted the spindles themselves with that same TS17 just to give them somewhat of a metal look. Then I went over with the calipers with just some gold. Now the actual spindle part that the wheel mounts to, it just simply slides in from the back and then the rotor goes back over it. Or so I thought. This is one of those times when it might be beneficial to read the instructions. As you can see, it was an extremely tight fit, so I didn't need to use any glue. And that's a good thing, because I had to go back and push this out afterwards. So if you follow my instructions, you assemble the caliper, pop the rotor in place, and then jab the spindle through from the back, and you'll be done. You'll have no problems. From what I remember on the road car, the Brembo decals did not fit the calipers. And I'm thinking that's what's going to go on here as well. The little bar thing in the middle there that this is supposed to mount to, the decal is too big and wraps around it, and it just looks goofy. So we're not going to use them. Now for the next couple of minutes, it's just standard step-by-step assembly. So I'm just going to shut my mouth and just let the video play. Now the rear brake assembly is much like the front, only difference is this time instead of a spindle, we have a parking brake. So you definitely have to have the rotor in place, and then much like the fronts, the little parking brake is extremely small and extra fiddly, so leave a little bit of sprue on there just to have something to hold on to. Now even though everything back here is a square peg, one would think that it would align perfectly. That is not the case. It's still somewhat loose. If at this point you decide to lock them in place with glue, make sure they're straight. Me, I'm gonna wait until later once I install the wheels because I think it might be easier to have a bigger area to work with to align it better. If you remember earlier when I said my chassis was just a little bit warped, this is where I ran into a bit of a problem, was trying to get everything to align and sit in place correctly. And that, my friends, is the end of the chassis. Now, we start getting into all the fun stuff. I don't know why Fujimi molded the rear windows closed. I'm gonna open them up, but real quick, I gotta show you a problem we're gonna run into once we do that. Now, if you remember that pile of carbon fiber hell from the last video, we're gonna need him for this. Once we get in and start cutting out the windows, you'll see that this entire area, or right here, is all out in the open. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use a little piece of plastic from this for sale sign, which is actually styrene, by the way. Now I cut mine just a little bit long so it'll wedge in there and just kind of be a friction fit. It's going to make all the test fitting and everything a whole lot easier because we don't need to use glue or tape. But as I'm sure you can see, all that does is just create that little shelf thing behind the seats just to close everything up. So, next order of business, we got to cut those windows out. Now luckily, these are just short, straight, simple little lines, so I'm just going to scribe them out. Now, ignore the big gnarly hole in the center of this one. I had this stupid idea to use a jigsaw just to speed it up, and it did not work. Don't use a jigsaw to do this. Now that the windows are opened up, we just got to go in and true up all those edges. Now in a perfect world, the blade I'm using to scribe would remain straight and not deviate or deflect left or right. So when I scribe these out with an X-Acto blade, I know it's not the proper tool, but the scribe line, it gets kind of wavy, especially when we're scribing thicker pieces of plastic. Now I know that there are just some wires molded in place and, well, they look terrible. So I'm going to go back in and add some. Now I'm not going to overdo it because a lot of this, believe it or not, is not going to be seen. So all I'm really going to do here, I'm going to keep it simple. I'm just going to add some various gauges of wire just to simulate, well, wires and hoses. This is one of those areas where less is definitely more. All I want to do is just add a sense of depth and dimension. Now I'm doing this all now, as you can see, because these holes need a little bit of cleaning up. It's going to be a lot harder to do later on when it's all painted. And I'm using that same TS17 from earlier to replicate all the heat shielding. Now I just got a few sink marks that the paint has brought to the surface. It's no big deal. That area is not visible once assembled. From here though, it's just more masking and painting, masking, painting, masking to create one single carbon fiber template, then painting. Nice. I am not going to be spilling these again anytime soon. They'll probably still stay standing even through a tornado. Probably. Now for the curious amongst you, this is a silicone sculpting brush used primarily for clay. The good thing about silicone is that almost nothing will stick to it. It has just enough friction to move a decal around, but not enough surface tension to grab onto it and lift it up. Now, even though the Maclaren F1 is my third favorite car, I'm not all that familiar with it. But judging by the size and location, I'm thinking these are actually heater hoses. This gets a big one and a little one, both at a 45-degree angle right there. Looking at the real car, there's actually two of these, and I think that they're for the oil cooler. I'm not entirely sure. Again, I don't know what any of these hoses I'm running actually are. Finally, we got this big long piece that runs along the driver's side. It's blue, so I'm thinking it's silicone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to paint this wire. It worked somewhat. The paint is reluctant to stick, but as long as I don't bend it, it will stay in place. Now this is a reference photo I was using during all this, so I hope I was able to do it some justice. About those rear windows, I have a crazy idea. Now believe it or not, but this 44-ounce cup is the exact radius we need for the rear windows. So I'm going to dump out the rest of my morning tea and get to cutting. But first, that's right, a template. And I just remembered that I have to use this template for the other side, so I gotta keep it intact. This crazy idea just might actually work. Now, in my mind, this is still a clear part, so I'm afraid super glue is going to hurt it. So I'm going to use my 5-second fix, the UV resin, to hold the top of it in place. Now, we do not need any at the bottom because that shelf thingy, I still don't know what it's called. The thing that we made earlier, it's actually going to hold the bottom in place. Now, off camera, I did a lot more test fitting to this piece, and what I found out is I actually got to add some edge pieces to it to further close up the opening. Now, it's kind of janky, it's not perfect, it does not have the clarity that I would want, but it has that reflection. And if anything, we could just say it's a race car, so those rear windows are Lexan. Yeah, let's go with that. Moment of truth. Let's put it all together and see how it looks. It looks good to me. What do you guys think? So, yeah, that's it. We're done with this video. Let me know what you guys think. Do you think this was worth all that extra work, or should I simply just said, hey, it's not going to be that visible, paint it black and move on? And